It is said that in ancient times, there was a judge known for his intelligence and wisdom in returning rights to their owners and repelling injustice from the oppressed. One was kind, and the other was cunning. The kind neighbor lived next to his neighbor without knowing that his neighbor possessed the qualities of cunning and deceit. One day, the wicked neighbor fell on hard times and was in dire need, finding nothing in his house to satisfy his hunger. So he went to his kind neighbor's house to ask for a loan, but he did not find him. However, his neighbor's wife told him that he had gone to work in the morning and had not yet returned. So the wicked neighbor decided to go to his neighbor at his workplace. As the wicked neighbor was walking on his way, he saw his neighbor returning from work. He stopped him and told him that he was in a difficult situation and asked him to lend him 1,000 dirhams. The kind neighbor did not hesitate to lend his neighbor a good loan. There was a palm tree nearby, and the kind neighbor said to his neighbor, "Tomorrow, God willing, I will arrange the 1,000 dirhams for you, and I will wait for you here next to this palm tree." The next day, the wicked neighbor went to meet his neighbor and take the 1,000 dirhams. When he arrived at the place, he found his neighbor waiting for him next to the palm tree, as he had promised. The kind neighbor had collected the 1,000 dirhams and then gave them to his neighbor as he had promised. The wicked neighbor said to his neighbor, "I will return this money to you after 3 months from now." The kind neighbor agreed to that without taking any document from his neighbor to prove it. After 3 months had passed, the kind neighbor went to his neighbor to reclaim the 1,000 dirhams, but the wicked neighbor denied the 1,000 dirhams he had taken from his neighbor. The kind neighbor was saddened by what he heard from his wicked neighbor and said to himself, "We have reached a time when good is repaid with evil and kindness with malice." But the kind neighbor had heard about the judge and his strong intelligence and shrewdness in preventing injustice and returning rights to their owners. So he went to him to complain about his neighbor. When he stood before him and told him what had happened with his neighbor, the judge asked one of the guards to bring that neighbor. When the wicked neighbor arrived, the judge looked at him and said, "Your neighbor claims that he lent you 1,000 dirhams. Is what your neighbor claims true?" The wicked neighbor denied what he heard from the judge and said, "Sir, I did not take anything from my neighbor, and I have never borrowed money from him before, and what he claims is a lie and slander." Then the judge looked at the kind neighbor and said to him, "Do you have a witness that your neighbor took 1,000 dirhams from you, or a document to prove it?" The kind neighbor said, "No, sir, but when I lent him the money, I trusted him, and it never occurred to me then that my neighbor would deny my right." The judge felt the sincerity of the kind neighbor's words and thought for a moment, then looked at him and said, "If you are truthful in what you say, and you did lend your neighbor 1,000 dirhams, then go and bring me a handful of dust from the place where you gave the money to your neighbor." The kind neighbor was surprised by the judge's request, but he did as he was asked, and quickly went to bring a handful of dust from the place where he had lent his neighbor the 1,000 dirhams. Time passed, and the kind neighbor did not return. So the judge began to look at the wicked neighbor, and suddenly asked him, "Your neighbor has been delayed for a long time. Do you know why he is delayed and has not returned yet?" Without thinking, the wicked neighbor replied, "That place where my neighbor went is very far." At that, the judge laughed and said, "Now you have proven to me the truth of what your neighbor claimed, and that he did lend you 1,000 dirhams." The wicked neighbor was terrified and then said, "And how is that, sir? If your neighbor was lying and had not lent you anything, as you say," the judge said, "you would not have known the place where your neighbor went to bring a handful of dust from. For that place is the same place where you took the money from your neighbor." And with that, the judge was able to prove the right of the kind neighbor, and ordered the wicked neighbor to be imprisoned until he returned the money he had taken from his neighbor, after he managed to solve 3 of the most difficult cases he encountered. The first case, it is said that 2 men lived next to each other. The second case, it is said that an old man rode his donkey and went to the market to bring a bag of flour to his house. When he arrived at the market, he bought a bag of flour, and that bag was heavy, so a strong man helped him and lifted the bag of flour from the ground and placed it on the donkey's back. Then the man rode his donkey with the bag of flour in front of him and set off for his house. On the way back, the donkey stumbled, and the bag of flour fell to the ground. The old man could not carry the bag of flour and put it back on the donkey's back again. While he was like that, a strong young man passed by, but he was rude and foolish. He looked at the man and said to him, "What are you doing standing here, old man?" The man said to the young man, "I went to the market and bought a bag of flour, and while I was returning home, the donkey stumbled, and the bag of flour fell to the ground, and I could not carry it back onto the donkey's back again." The young man said, "I can carry that bag and put it back on the donkey's back again, but what will you give me in return?" The old man said, "Nothing." So the young man carried the bag of flour and placed it on the donkey's back. Then the old man rode behind the bag of flour. When he was about to leave, the young man said, "Where are you going, old man?" The man said, "I am going home, my son." The young man said, "And where is what you promised me?" The old man said, "I did not promise you anything." The young man rudely said, "You are lying, old man." The old man said, "My son, I do not understand what you mean by these words." The young man said, "When I lifted the bag of flour for you from the ground and asked you what you would give me in return, you said nothing, and I want the nothing you promised me." The old man was surprised by the young man's words and wanted to explain to the young man and said, "When you asked me about the compensation, I had nothing to give you, so I said nothing." The young man said, "That's none of my business, and you must give me the nothing you promised me." The man stood perplexed and said to the young man, "My son, how can I give you the nothing I promised you?" The young man said, "I told you, that's none of my business, and I must take what you promised me." The old man had no choice but to go to the judge, so that he would look into this matter and relieve him of that young man. The old man and the young man went to the judge. When they stood before him and told him their story, the judge was surprised by this story. He looked at the old man and said, "You, old man, promised the young man nothing in return for carrying the bag of flour onto the donkey's back." The old man said, "Yes, sir, that's right." Then he looked at the young man and said, "And you now want the nothing that old man promised you?" The young man said, "Yes, sir, that's right." At that, the judge knew that this young man was characterized by rudeness and foolishness. So he thought for a moment, then ordered one of the guards to bring the donkey with the bag of flour on it into the courtroom. Those present were surprised by that, and no one knew what the judge wanted to do. But the guard went and brought the donkey with the bag of flour on it and stood it before the judge. Then the judge looked at the young man challengingly and said to him, "Young man, if you want to take what the old man promised you, then take the bag of flour off the donkey's back and put it on the ground." The young man did what the judge asked and took the bag of flour off the donkey's back and put it on the ground. Then the judge said to the young man, "Now, lift the bag of flour from the ground and put it back on the donkey's back again." The young man did what the judge asked and lifted the bag of flour from the ground and put it on the donkey's back. Then the judge said to the young man, "What did you find under the bag of flour when you lifted it from the ground and put it on the donkey's back?" The young man said, "Nothing." At that, the judge laughed and said to the young man, "Then take it, for this is what the old man promised you." And with that, the judge was able to make the young man drink from the same cup that the poor old man had drunk from.
The third case. It is said that a man had 3 sons, and all 3 sons had the same name. Before their father passed away, he wrote a will in which he said, "Zaid inherits, and Zaid inherits, and Zaid does not inherit." When the sons read this will, they were surprised by what was written in it, and looked at each other in confusion, not knowing what their father meant by this will. The brothers kept wondering who the Zaid who does not inherit was, as all 3 brothers had the same name, but they knew that their father wanted to disinherit one of them. The brothers found no solution but to go to the judge to look into their matter. When they stood before the judge and told him their story, the judge said, "Do you have this will with you?" The brothers said, "Yes, sir." Then they took out the will and gave it to him. When the judge read that will, he was surprised and said to himself, "What did their father mean by this will?" So he began to think for a moment until he suspected that one of the brothers was not the man's son, but he wanted to prove that definitively. After deep thought, the judge asked the guard to take the 3 brothers out of the hall, then bring them in one after another. The guard did as the judge ordered, and began to bring the brothers into the hall one after another. When the first Zaid entered, the judge said to him, "Zaid, the court has thought a lot about this case, and has found no solution but to exhume your father's grave so that we can match his fingerprints, for perhaps this will was forged. Do you agree to that?" Zaid angrily said, "No, sir, I do not agree to this at all, and I cannot see my father humiliated before my eyes after his death, no matter the cost, and I do not want anything from this inheritance, and I will waive my right to this inheritance for my brothers." So the judge said to him, "Then leave now and wait outside the hall." Then the judge ordered the second Zaid to enter the hall. When the second Zaid entered, the judge looked at him and said to him, "Zaid, the court has thought a lot about this case, and has found no solution but to exhume your father's grave so that we can match his fingerprints, for perhaps this will was forged. Do you agree to that?" The second Zaid also did not agree to this, and said to the judge, "I do not want anything from this inheritance." and he also wanted to waive his right to the inheritance for his brothers. So the judge said to him, "Then leave now and wait outside the hall." Then the judge ordered the third Zaid to enter the hall. When the third Zaid entered, the judge looked at him and said to him, "Zaid, the court has thought a lot about this case and has found no solution but to exhume your father's grave so that we can match his fingerprints. For perhaps this will was forged. Do you agree to that?" At that, the third Zaid said, "If you must exhume my father's grave, there is no problem, and the living are more important than the dead." Judge knew that this Zaid was the one intended in the will, and that he was not one of that man's sons. At that, if this Zaid had been his son, he would not have agreed to exhume his father's grave for the sake of money. And with that, the judge was able to know which of the brothers was not that man's son. After that, the judge became famous for his strong intelligence and shrewdness among the judges of his era. And everyone knew that a judge who possesses intelligence, shrewdness, and wisdom can differentiate between the oppressor and the oppressed, and that the oppressor cannot deceive the wise judge and cannot escape punishment. And thus the oppressed will have been able to obtain his rights.